looks like it's ugly itself. I didn't understand that, so to speak, in that sense, how that could be. I was learning about that in my own therapy, with myself and stuff like that, and began to try and grasp this better, but it was still to show this creature that I expected to be the usual, typical thing, was to have an implication about me, myself, the one who felt this feeling, the one who felt despicable, the one who secretly who really felt ugly and disgusting. I never encountered some kind of, so to speak, imagined, it's all in my imagination, feedback or commentary that's given me that message, and thus about what same-sex relationship is about. It hadn't really entered my mind much. And more, at the time of my experiencing this, it felt like the experience of it was alive inside my experience of it. And it felt like more than just the experience of it, that it was like the thinking or understanding of an attitude, even kind of like a person. And I became really fascinated with that sense that I was then experiencing. I wanted to follow that out. And that's what eventually led to a whole new kind of thesis, master's thesis, which is on this whole idea, how could there be something that felt like what Jungian called the soul, but of the same sex. And if you know standard Jungian thought, you know there's no equivalent of the contrasexual figure in Jungian theory. Classical, what would now be called classical Jungian theory. There are same-sex figures, and one can have intimate relationships with them. In fact, Jung himself has several places where he discusses friendships with important teaching figures, personal ones, okay? But they're all of the type that I mentioned to you, like this charming little book here. So if these people do all these things with nothing below the waist. Another happy example of that, so you'll appreciate that, Roger, is Star Wars movie. There's lots of serious relationships going on in that. But almost everything, except for one official heterosexual thing, is simply non-existent, as if there's nothing below the waist. Now, it's one thing to show that people that never seem to go to the toilet. That's okay, I understand that. It's another thing, huh? It's another thing to say they never have any sex. That's what the Pope says. That's what the Dalai Lama says. So I always felt that it would be really interesting to want to understand in a little more technical way after I'd begun to figure out from that experience and then thinking about it more what this idea was that I was encountering a transpersonal figure who wanted to love me and be loved by me, who represented, as you would call it, the soul of the psyche, the feeling of aliveness, and I don't really mean so much the literalness of the feeling of being alive, as the tones of that, the inner substantiality as that might be felt emotionally and sensatively and viscerally, and there are lots of different ways, instinctively, intuitively, there's lots of different ways to experience. Let's call it the spirit of aliveness, sensibility of aliveness, the knowingness of aliveness. That stuff is hard to distinguish, and Jung would often use the word spirit in distinction to the word soul. Soul here more he's trying to reference the idea of being experience, taking in and experiencing qualities of experiential life, of living life. Here in terms of what things he would call the numinous, or that we get so subliminally fascinated with all the time in the old days, but it fascinated most of us in a religious sense, or traditional spiritual sense, or sometimes in a philosophical sense, or sometimes now more recently in the science, not so much now, but in the last century, in the scientific sense. that thing that makes things fascinating. Does that. And it's on account of how that's a general thing, that all things can thus be symbolic in our experience, but in particular, as you can perhaps imagine, when it becomes sexual. And by sexual, I mean genital level of experience. So again, we're human beings, and when we're genitals, we're human beings. And so we have human genitals. And this human genital experience, and though, as I mentioned at the outset, many of us may compartmentalize that, nonetheless, that's not the way it itself exists itself. And that can all be something that can be developed and grown around more. So, okay, I think that's reasonable. It's not a very long paper, folks. So I always wanted a chance to come back to figure out Frankenstein a little bit more particularly. And after that helped me develop the idea of this notion of a same-sex soul figure. Soul figure. So it's on the same level. So if you look at traditional Jungian thought, you'll see that there's different ways to interpret why Jung is writing the way he was. He has reasons why he would describe the figure that would personify the sense of soul. So soul comes in everything of the psyche has soul. But it can personify itself. It can come in and try to personify. And that way it makes a personal relationship. Sometimes it can be other kinds of creatures besides a human, of course, but personifying, suggesting that those times or situations in which the soul, or soul feeling, or those soul aspects or qualities, I think, is a spirit, take on this personal quality, very personal quality. And that can happen in different kinds of ways in a, so to speak, technical sense. Any powerful figure, like in a fairy tale or something, could be seen as a soul figure representing an aspect or important aspect of soul, or the experience of soul, or the encounter with soul, which is one way of the soul here is one way of describing the mystery of psyche. Okay, but by mystery I do not mean any old thing. As Jung used it, he didn't mean any old thing. He means individuation, the mystery of individuation. Okay, when we feel mystery, period, okay, that means individuation. All things that are found mysterious, okay, or have something magical about them. What is that magical quality? Not the thing itself, perhaps, but that numinous quality. So here, the numinosity itself, and not just the things that might seem numinous or not, in particular experiences. All involves what he described as this realization in the psyche of the possibility of what we call the archetype of the self. So archetypes in this sense, they don't really exist, but they're potentialities. By exist, I mean in subjectivity. I'm not talking about those chairs on the floor. I'm talking about existence in the world of subjectivity. But when I talk about archetypes as not existing, see, yet they are there as pre-existent meaning, patterns. It's obviously I'm speaking in a paradoxical way. We get to aspects and levels of understanding which I hope if humanity survives, eventually we all figure it out in a much more common language kind of way, even than what might seem like what we're the edge of psychological understanding, at least from this direction of the interface between psychology and physics. But if humanity survives, I'm going to suggest to you there might be the chance that humanity could discover that we actually, this place now, okay, I'll suggest to you a story, but I'll suggest we could discuss the meaning of it. We're not all alone here. We're heavily observed right now. Nothing we do is ever it's just what we see, what we feel, what we hear, and those levels. You have to go to the quote, occult, unquote, to reference what I'm talking about otherwise. Okay, many traditional cultures would, as you well know, like the Bibles and Western culture, this sort of sensibility too, of course, even back in the 70s, in the hippie era and so on, little stuff like that. Okay, so nonetheless, how does that relate to being gay now? Well, you see, that didn't just start now. That started all along in the historical forces at work. I'm not going to get into tonight discussing a whole lot of that stuff itself. Okay, but at the time of Mary Shelley's novel, Frankenstein, okay, there were people who were tired of having to live a lie. that they didn't yet have a basis of really an alternative. Yeah, as in a few generations, people will continue such a picture, generation after generation after generation, are getting more and more uppity under this regime of murder and utter silencing. Okay, and there's folks start to be uppity, let's call it. And you have to be, at first, how you could be uppity might seem to us now strange or peculiar. I'm going to suggest to you Frankenstein is an example of that. And that's an early work of gay rights. Okay? With the idea, which had not yet been separated from our notion now of being homosexual, that there's something spiritual connected with becoming gay. The same-sex desire once fulfilled. More and more so. And that's actually very ancient, as I'm suggesting to you. So I was always really interested in wanting to understand that a little bit better after this big experience. And when I got that chance, after I've written this first article, and I wanted to do more on that Jungian level versus a book kind of level, then I turned to the Frankenstein story. So I'll read you now this little article I wrote back then, 30 years ago. I might comment on it a little bit as we go on. This is an old piece of scholarship now. And as you'll notice, I added one footnote for any of you who are careful scholars at the end of the paper. I've added a footnote noting the addition of the novel which I used in the paper, which was not in the original set of footnotes. And unfortunately, because now I've learned all these things, I have actually the quotations I'll be reading to you from the novel from the 1831 version, which unfortunately have been somewhat already mutilated from the original 1818 version. It's just the way that it is. The main point is still the same anyway, what version it was. Or what any of these technical arguments are about it. The point is still the same. The essence of the story is still the same thing. And also, as I mentioned before, you'll see I'm going to reference research on Kafka. Again, in a sense, context, 30 years ago. How to talk about this. No one had ever talked about the novel Frankenstein in this kind of way before that. And I had seen something on TV that, as you can see, later on discovered it was co-written by Christopher Isherwood, whose lover Don McCarty, and was meant to be covertly highly homosexual, but even then was not quite up front. So this is The Problem of Frankenstein, 1977. The novel Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus by Mary Shelley, has cast a strong fascination over Western society ever since its appearance in 1818. And this interest continues unabated today in the form of films, teleplays, stage plays, critical studies, even children's cartoons. Frankenstein has become a cultural myth. People say it speaks to them, to the modern condition. Frankenstein is one of the few living symbols left in our soulless age. Perhaps this is because it's a story about loss of soul, about the struggle to be human. The usual interpretation, overly ambitious man spawns technological monster, merely scratches the surface of the great problem posed in this story, the problem which begins with the question, quote, "Did I request thee, maker, from my clay to mold me, man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me?" Unquote. Now, if you read that as being about being gay, it takes on a whole different meaning. If you simply read it as being about being homosexual, did you mold me homosexual? Did you make me a homosexual person in an era when that was not tolerated? And I was smart and bright and sensitive and intelligent and spiritually minded and so on and so forth, you see? The pickle's already set up there, I would suggest. But again, it's in code. You have to be able to see it in that kind of way. Of course, it had to be hidden at the time, otherwise they would have been murdered no matter what. In telling us this story about a man who fails, as Dr. Frankenstein fails, Mary Shelley reaches into the heart of an archetypal problem, which also contains as well the roots of success. In examining the forces at work here, we can unfold a creative Newman that heals the ignorance and bloodshed of Dr. Frankenstein's world, a world all too much like our own.